Ruth Calloway was, in her own manner, equally instructive. She was a woman of few words and tremendous precision, a woman who kept accounts in a narrow ledger with handwriting so small and so exact that it looked like it had been etched by a watchmaker's tool rather than written by a human hand. She taught Nora to keep records, to document transactions, to understand that a written account was not a formality but a form of armor. That the world would attempt, again and again, to rewrite what had actually happened, and the only defense against that rewriting was a clear, witnessed, dated record. Nora did not always love this lesson. She was a physical creature, a maker of things, and the patience required to sit and inscribe figures in a ledger chafed against her nature. But Ruth Calloway was not a woman who offered lessons that could be declined, and so Nora learned. She learned well enough that decades later, when it mattered most, the habit of careful documentation would be the thing that saved not just herself but an entire valley's worth of people who had trusted the wrong man with their most important papers. She married at 22, in 1866, a quiet year in a country still tender from war. His name was Thomas Calloway, no relation before the marriage. A rancher from southwestern Colorado who had come east looking for cattle stock and found instead a woman standing in a field repairing a wheel spoke with a mallet and a wedge, doing it correctly, which was not something he had ever seen a person do correctly on the first attempt. They were married in 6 months and moved west by the following spring. The land they settled on was called the Ridge Creek Flats, a broad, high-altitude grazing valley in the southwestern Colorado Territory, and it was, in the years when the grass was good and the water ran clear, about as close to sufficient as the frontier ever allowed. They built a house with timber they milled themselves. They built a barn, a root cellar, a smokehouse, and a spring-fed trough. They bought cattle, 100 head to start and then gradually more, and they ran them on open range in summer and brought them down to the flats in winter, and for nearly 20 years this life held together with the steady, unremarkable dignity of good construction. Thomas died in the winter of 1884, a lung sickness that arrived in October and did not release him until February, and after that it was only Nora, and the land, and the cattle, and the work. She did not collapse. That was the thing people who knew her always said afterward, when they were trying to describe her, when they were searching for the quality that had carried her through what came next. She did not collapse. She grieved thoroughly and privately, in the way that people who have known real work grieve, by continuing to work, by letting the grief run along beneath everything like water under ice, cold and present and moving. She hired a hand named Cato Brindle who was honest. He set up an office on the main street of Ridge Creek under the sign of the Crick Land and Lending Company, and he began to offer loans to ranchers and farmers whose operations were being squeezed by 2 consecutive dry summers. The terms he offered were clear on the surface and treacherous underneath. Variable interest clauses buried in dense contractual language, acceleration provisions that allowed him to call the full balance due on 30 days' notice if a single quarterly payment arrived late, cross-collateralization terms that linked a borrower's other properties to any loan they had taken from him regardless of whether those properties had been offered as security. Most of the people in Ridge Creek Valley were not lawyers. They were cattlemen and farmers and their wives, people who understood soil and weather and the price of beef but who had no particular reason to distrust a man whose surface manner was as warm and reassuring as a fire in a cold room. They signed. Many of them signed. Nora Calloway signed. She had needed the bridge loan to carry her through that second dry summer, and the amount she borrowed was modest, and she had believed. As anyone reading only the plain language of the first page of that document would have believed, that the terms were fair. They were not fair. They never had been. And in the summer of 1886, Aldous Crick began to show what he had actually been constructing all along. He called notes early. He found reasons, a payment received on a Tuesday that he claimed, through a technicality of the contract language, should have arrived on Monday. A drought-reduced payment that triggered a clause none of his borrowers had understood was present. Nora received her notice in July of 1887, a single piece of paper delivered by Crick's clerk, a nervous young man named Hewitt who could not meet her eyes as he handed it over. The notice informed her that the balance of her loan, which she had, by her own careful accounting, reduced by nearly 2/3, had been accelerated in full and was due within 30 days. The amount stated was not the remainder of her original loan. It was a figure, inflated by compounding interest calculations she had never agreed to, that exceeded the assessed value of her land. She read the letter standing at her kitchen table. She read it 3 times. Then she went to find her own copy of the contract, because her mother had taught her to always keep her own copy, and she read through it line by line until she found the clause he had invoked. It was on the 4th page, in the smallest type on any page of the document, embedded in a subsection labeled Administrative Provisions, and it was, by any honest reading, monstrous. She went to see Ridge Creek's only lawyer, a man named Foster Quill, who operated out of a dusty office above the feed store, and Foster Quill looked at the document for a long time and then told her, with genuine sorrow in his voice, that the clause was enforceable. There are things the frontier does not forgive. It does not forgive weakness, it does not forgive hesitation, and it does not forgive a woman who arrives at the edge of a canyon with rope-burned hands, 43 years of honest living behind her, and exactly $3.50 to her name. That was the sum of it, the entire arithmetic of Nora Calloway's life, reduced to a small leather pouch worn thin at the seam. The banker had taken the land. The drought had taken the cattle. And a fire that smelled, to anyone who knew such things, just a little too much like kerosene, had taken the house. What remained was a woman standing at the lip of Carrion Drop Canyon on the outskirts of Ridge Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1887, staring down at a wagon that had been swallowed by the earth and forgotten there. The wagon master at the Ridge Creek salvage post had laughed when she'd laid her coins on his counter. He'd taken them anyway. $3.50. For a broken-down Conestoga nobody else wanted, wedged 60 feet below the canyon rim, half buried in red shale and pale river grass. They called her foolish. They called her worse than foolish. But something in the grain of that weathered wood spoke to Nora in a language she recognized, the language of things that had been left for dead and weren't. She did not know then what was sealed beneath the wagon's floorboards. She did not know that what she was hauling up from that canyon would not only rebuild her own life but restore a whole community that a single greedy man had been quietly dismantling for years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Calloway. If you have ever looked at something broken and seen something the rest of the world missed, leave us a comment below. We read every single one. Nora Calloway was born in the spring of 1844 in a limestone farmhouse outside of Harlan County, Kentucky, the second of 6 children born to Emmett and Ruth Calloway, who between them possessed a Bible, a cast-iron stove, 40 acres of thin soil, and a profound, unshakable belief that the quality of a person was measured entirely by what they did with their hands. Emmett Calloway was a carpenter and a wheelwright, and he was, by the account of every man and woman who ever watched him work, among the finest craftsmen in 3 counties. He did not merely build things. He understood them. The way a joint needed to breathe in summer and hold tight in winter, the way a wheel spoke carried weight not just downward but outward and inward in the same instant, the way wood had memory and would always, given time and pressure, try to return to the shape it had known as a living tree. He taught all 6 of his children what he knew, but Nora was the one who truly listened. From the time she was 9 years old and standing on an overturned bucket to reach the workbench, she absorbed his lessons the way dry ground absorbs rain, completely, and without waste. She learned to read. What she did, over the next 90 days, was fight. She wrote letters to the Territorial Land Office. She wrote to the Circuit Court at Durango. She filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Territorial Banking Commission, which was a body that existed on paper and was, she discovered, staffed by one part-time clerk who had not answered correspondence in 4 months. She argued with Aldous Crick directly, in his office, across his polished desk, with her contract in her hand and her mother's ledger of every payment she had ever made, and he listened to her with the expression of a man watching rain fall on land he already owned. In September of 1887, the sheriff's deputies came and she let them take it. The land, the cattle that remained after the drought, the barn and the smokehouse and the root cellar and the house where she had lived for 21 years. She let them take it because fighting them physically would have cost her her freedom, and she needed her freedom for what came next. She walked away with the clothes on her back, a carpetbag containing her most important documents, her mother's ledger, her father's set of woodworking chisels in their leather roll, and the contents of a tin she had kept buried beneath the floor of the smokehouse precisely for an emergency of this magnitude. The tin contained $3.50. She walked to town, and she sat on the bench outside the Ridge Creek post office, and she tried to think about what a person with $3.50 and a set of woodworking tools could do in a world that had just taken everything from her. She was 43 years old. She was not old, but she was not young, and the frontier did not manufacture sympathy for either state. She had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when she overheard two men from the salvage post talking as they passed. One of them was describing a wagon that had rolled off the Carrion Drop Canyon Road 3 years before, apparently during a flash flood that had also taken the team and the driver, whose body had been recovered but whose cargo manifest had been lost in the water. The wagon had never been retrieved. It had been sitting down in the canyon ever since, and the salvage post had recently posted it available for a nominal claim fee because it was taking up space on their inventory ledger without generating any revenue. The man said the claim fee was $3.50. The other man said it wasn't worth a cent more than the paper that fee was printed on, that the wagon had been down there 3 years and was probably nothing but kindling and rust. They laughed and walked on. Nora sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her carpetbag and walked to the salvage post. The man behind the counter was named Dort Feeney, and he was a broad, slope-shouldered individual with the general disposition of someone who had spent many years being mildly disappointed by human beings. He looked at Nora's coins on his counter the way a man looks at something he never expected to see. He looked at Nora. He looked back at the coins. He wrote out a claim receipt without saying much, though he did, as he slid it across the counter, remark that the wagon was 60 feet down in a red shale canyon with no road access and that hauling it up would require equipment she did not have and skills she probably did not possess. She told him she had skills she possessed. She took her receipt and she walked to the canyon. Carrion Drop Canyon earned its name from the turkey vultures that rode its thermals in long, patient circles, waiting on the various misfortunes of the creatures below. It was a narrow, deep cut in the mesa plateau, perhaps 200 feet from rim to floor, though the wagon had come to rest on a broad shale ledge about 60 feet down where the canyon wall stepped outward before dropping again. The trail to that ledge was steep and loose, all crumbling shale and dry brush, but it was navigable on foot, and Nora navigated it. She stood before the wagon in the thin afternoon light and breathed for a moment and simply looked. It was a modified Conestoga, old pattern, the kind built in the 1860s for heavy freight rather than emigrant families, wider bed, heavier axle mounts, lower bow hoops. The canvas cover was long gone, stripped away by 3 years of canyon wind. 2 of the 4 wheels were broken beyond use. The left side of the bed had taken the impact of the fall and was stove in along the lower strake, the wood split and gray. But the frame members, the long hardwood sills running the length of the wagon's undercarriage, were intact. And the floor. The floor of the wagon bed was intact. Nora climbed up onto the bed and walked it, feeling the boards beneath her feet the way her father had taught her, pressing at the edges, listening to the wood's response. It was sound. The floor was tight-joined hardwood, not the poplar commonly used in emigrant wagons, but oak. Somebody had spent real money on this floor. Somebody had wanted this floor to be strong. She pulled her father's chisels from the leather roll in her carpetbag. She ran her fingertips across the floorboards in the fading light, moving slowly from one end of the bed to the other. Near the front of the wagon, just beneath where the driver's box would have been, she found it. The grain changed. Not dramatically, nothing that would announce itself to a casual observer, nothing that would catch an untrained eye. But there, in a section of floor roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, the grain of the planking ran in a slightly different direction than the planking around it, and the joints at the edges of that section were, when she pressed them, perhaps a millimeter deeper than they should have been. A seam, not a crack. A deliberate seam, fitted and matched so carefully that it had survived 3 years at the bottom of a canyon without opening. She put the chisel to it and she worked, slowly and with great care, the way her father had taught her to work when she did not yet know what was on the other side of a thing. The light was almost gone when the panel lifted free in her hands. The false bottom of that wagon was approximately 8 inches deep, sealed with a thin sheet of tin lining that had kept it dry even in the flash flood. Inside it, wrapped in oilskin bundles tied with cord, were papers. A great many papers. Nora gathered them carefully and tucked them into her carpetbag and climbed back up out of the canyon in the near dark, and she did not open them until she was seated at the single table in the single room she had rented for 20 cents a night at the Ridge Creek widow house run by a woman named Augusta Pell, who asked no questions and supplied a kerosene lamp without being asked. In the light of that lamp, Nora untied the first oilskin bundle and opened it, and she understood within the first 3 pages that she was holding something extraordinary and dangerous. The papers were the records of a man named Harlan Shreve. The name meant nothing to Nora at first. It was not a name she recognized from Ridge Creek, but as she read, she began to understand who Harlan Shreve had been. He had been, for 12 years prior to 1884, a land agent and notary operating out of Durango, Colorado, and he had spent those 12 years serving as the legal instrument of Aldous Crick's land acquisition operation. What Nora was holding was not merely a set of business records. It was a complete documentary history of fraud. Carefully assembled, meticulously documented, apparently by a man who had begun as Crick's willing instrument and had, over time, become his conscience-stricken archivist. There were original loan documents, the actual contracts signed by borrowers, not the copies that borrowers had been given, but the originals, which in several cases differed from those copies in significant ways. There were handwritten notations in Shreve's careful script, cross-referencing discrepancies between what borrowers had been told and what they had actually signed. There were letters between Crick and Shreve in which Crick was explicit about his intentions, which parcels he wanted, which families he intended to squeeze out, which clauses he expected to activate and when. There were records of deed transfers in which properties acquired through Crick's loan manipulations had been transferred to shell entities and then resold at significant profit. There were, in the third bundle, records of specific transactions that affected 31 Ridge Creek Valley families, including, on page 47 of a ledger bound in brown cloth, a notation regarding a ranch in the Ridge Creek Flats belonging to A.T. and N. Calloway, and a marginal note in Shreve's hand that read, "Loan terms altered on execution, copy per A.K. instruction, originals retained here, do not return." Nora sat for a long time with that page open in front of her. The lamp burned low. Augusta Pell moved quietly in the other room, doing whatever Augusta Pell did in the evenings, and the town made its small nighttime noises outside the window, and Nora Calloway sat in a pool of amber light and looked at her own name written in a dead man's hand, and understood that the wagon at the bottom of Carrion Drop Canyon had been a dead man's attempt to be witnessed. Harlan Shreve had died in a flash flood in the autumn of 1884. The same flood, she realized, that had sent the wagon over the canyon rim. She did not think it was an accident that those papers had been in that wagon. She thought Harlan Shreve had been carrying them somewhere, to Durango, perhaps, or to Santa Fe, to someone with the authority to act on them, and that the flood had interrupted him in a final, irreversible way. And then the canyon had kept his secret for 3 years, waiting for someone willing to haul up what others had dismissed. She began to sort the documents with the same precision her mother had brought to her narrow ledger. She worked through the night, organizing the papers by family name, by transaction date, by type of fraud, altered terms, forged co-signatures, backdated acceleration notices. When the lamp burned out, she lit a candle. When the candle guttered, she waited for dawn and worked by window light. By mid-morning she had a clear picture of what she was holding and what it would mean if it reached the right hands. She also had a clear picture of what it would mean for Aldous Crick if it did. He would lose everything he had taken. He might lose considerably more than that. And she understood, sitting in that small room with her carpetbag and her chisels and 31 families' worth of stolen futures spread across a plank table, that this was not, could not be, a matter of what Nora Calloway personally stood to recover. This was a matter of every family in Ridge Creek Valley who had lost their land to a system built on lies, and who deserved to have those lies named and answered. But first she had to be careful. Because Aldous Crick was not a man who had built this operation without also building protection for it. He had, over 4 years in Ridge Creek, cultivated relationships with the county assessor, the local magistrate, and at least 2 members of the territorial legislature. Foster Quill, the lawyer who had told Nora her contract was enforceable, was a decent man but a frightened one, and Nora did not believe he had the constitution for a direct confrontation with Crick's machinery. She needed someone outside that machinery. She needed someone with standing in a court that Crick had not yet reached. She found him in the unlikely form of a federal circuit examiner named Augusto Parrish, who was not stationed in Ridge Creek and who was, in fact, supposed to be passing through on his way to Durango to audit an unrelated mining lease dispute. Nora learned of his presence from Augusta Pell, who had a remarkable talent for knowing where every person of consequence in Ridge Creek was at any given moment, and she intercepted Parrish at the Ridge Creek Inn dining room on a Wednesday morning while he was eating his breakfast, and she sat down across from him without being invited and placed one document on the table in front of him, just one, the letter in Crick's own hand naming the Hollenbeck family's property as a target. And she watched his face as he read it. Parrish was a thin, tired-looking man in his 50s who had the eyes of someone who had spent a long career looking for things people were trying to hide. He read the letter. He read it again. He set it down. He looked at Nora. He said, quietly, "How many more are there?" She told him. She told him there were documents pertaining to 31 families spanning 4 years of systematic fraud. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her where she had found them, and she told him about the canyon and the wagon and the false bottom, and he listened to all of it without expression, and then he asked her what she wanted. She told him. She told him she did not want money. She wanted the deeds returned. She wanted the altered contracts presented to a federal court with jurisdiction over Crick's banking operation. She wanted the 31 families of Ridge Creek Valley to have what was theirs returned to them, including, if the law allowed it, compensation for what they had lost in the years since the fraud had operated against them. Parrish looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked her if she could have all the documents organized and copied within 4 days. She told him she could do it in 2. It took exactly 2 days. What followed was not a dramatic single event but a process. The kind of slow, methodical unwinding that federal legal proceedings produce when the evidence is complete and the examiner is competent and the fraudster, for once, has nowhere to run. Parrish took the documents to Durango. Durango communicated with the Territorial Banking Commission and with the Federal District Court at Denver. Crick's accounts were frozen in the first week of November 1887. A federal examiner arrived in Ridge Creek the following week to begin interviewing the affected families and comparing their copies of their loan documents against the originals in Shreve's records. Crick made one attempt to dismiss the proceedings through his connections at the county level, and that attempt collapsed in approximately 48 hours when the federal examiner made clear that county-level influence was not relevant to a federal fraud investigation. Aldous Crick did not flee, which surprised some people and did not surprise Nora. She had looked into the man's eyes across his polished desk on the day she had argued for her land, and she had seen something in him that she recognized, not conscience, exactly, but a particular kind of vanity that made it impossible for him to admit, even to himself, that his position was untenable. He stayed in Ridge Creek and hired lawyers from Denver and prepared to fight, and the fight consumed the rest of that winter and the following spring, and at the end of it he lost. The federal court found the loan contracts fraudulent. The deed transfers were reversed. 31 families received their properties back, or, in cases where the properties had been further sold to innocent third parties, received compensation from the liquidation of Crick's assets. The process was imperfect, as legal processes are, and some families received less than they had lost, and the years of anxiety and displacement could not be returned. But the land came back. Most of it came back. Nora Calloway's land came back. She stood on it in the early spring of 1888 and looked at the house that was still standing. Crick's people had rented it to a succession of tenants and had not much improved it, but neither had they demolished it, and she stood there in the cold air with the smell of thawed earth and dry grass coming up around her, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time. She did not name it. She did not need to name it. She simply stood there and breathed. She went back for the wagon. That surprised people too, perhaps more than anything else she had done. The land was back, the cattle could be rebuilt, the house needed repairs she was entirely capable of making. Why would she go back for a broken-down Conestoga at the bottom of a canyon? But Nora went back for it. She borrowed a team and a block and tackle rig from the Hollenbeck family, who had received their 160 acres back in February and who felt, with deep sincerity, that they owed Nora Calloway whatever she might need for as long as she might need it. She spent 3 days rigging the hull, reinforcing the wagon's frame with timber she cut and shaped herself, replacing the broken wool hubs with new ones she turned on a borrowed lathe in the Ridge Creek livery. On the morning of the 4th day she brought the wagon up out of the canyon, foot by foot, the block and tackle groaning in the cold air and the shale rattling loose under the wagon's skids, and when it came over the rim and settled onto level ground she stood back and looked at it for a long time. It was not a beautiful object. It was a scarred and battered and ancient piece of freight equipment that had spent 3 years at the bottom of a canyon, and no amount of repair would make it new. But it was sound. The frame was sound, the floor was sound, that remarkable, carefully joined oak floor with its secret chamber now empty and cleaned and smelling of the oilskin and the stories it had once carried. She did not sell the wagon. She did not use it for freight. She parked it at the edge of her property near the road, and she built a small roof structure over it against the weather, and she planted a mountain ash sapling next to it, because mountain ash was what her mother had grown outside the Kentucky farmhouse and she had always associated its bright fall berries with the feeling of home. People rode past and looked at the wagon and at the tree, and occasionally someone would stop and ask about them, and she would tell the story. She told it plainly and without elaboration, the way her father had taught her to describe the thing she had made: start at the grain, end at the joint, let the wood speak for itself. Let the work speak for itself. Dort Feeney, who had taken her $3.50 across the salvage post counter with barely concealed contempt, came to see her in the summer of 1888. He came on a Saturday, hat in hand, which on Dort Feeney was a posture that did not come naturally. He told her he had heard what she had done and he wanted to say that he was glad she had made the claim. She looked at him for a moment. She told him she was glad too. He left, and she went back to repairing her fence line, and that was the end of that. The mockery, she noticed, had grown very quiet. The men who had laughed when she'd laid her coins on Feeney's counter did not laugh now, though neither, to be fair, did they particularly acknowledge what they had laughed at. That was all right. Nora had not done what she had done in order to be acknowledged by men who had laughed at her. She had done it because the canyon had given her the papers and the papers had named a wrong that needed to be corrected, and she had been the one standing there with a chisel and the knowledge of what a false bottom looked and felt like. The rightness of what she had done did not depend on whether anyone else understood it. It simply was what it was. A thing done correctly, a joint fitted true, a piece of work completed. She rebuilt the cattle herd slowly, over 2 years, buying selectively and managing carefully. She hired Cato Brindle back, and he came without needing to be asked twice. She replanted the kitchen garden and repaired the chimney and replaced the south wall of the barn where rot had crept in during the tenancy years. She did all of this the way her father had taught her to do any work, steadily, without drama, attending to what was in front of her, trusting the grain to tell her where the strength was. By the autumn of 1889, the Calloway Ranch looked, to anyone passing on the road, very much as it had looked before. To Nora it looked different. It looked like something that had been tested and had held. That was not the same as something that had simply stood because it had never been challenged. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference. And sometimes in the evenings, when the light came down off the mesa in that long, amber, autumn way and gilded the wagon in its small shelter by the road, she would look at it and think about Harlan Shreve. A man she had never met, a man who had done wrong and then spent years trying to find a way to account for it, a man who had died in a flood with his conscience in an oilskin bundle beneath a false floor. She did not know if he had found peace in those last moments or terror or some mixture of both. She hoped he had found something like peace. She hoped that the water that had taken him had also absolved him, in some quiet way that courts and legal proceedings could not quite reach. She hoped that wherever he was, he knew the papers had arrived. They had taken a strange road and a long time, but they had arrived, and they had done what he had meant them to do. She thought that had to count for something. She thought it counted for quite a great deal. The mountain ash sapling grew. It was, by the early 1890s, a young tree of some real presence, catching the light in September with its clusters of bright orange berries flaring against the blue Colorado sky like small, persistent fires. Children from neighboring properties sometimes stopped to look at it on their way past. She did not mind. She would wave to them from wherever she happened to be working, and sometimes they would wave back, and that was sufficient. That was, in the arithmetic of a life honestly lived, more than sufficient. This is the story we carry from Nora Calloway, not the story of what she found, though what she found mattered enormously, but the story of why she went looking in the first place. She went into that canyon because she had $3.50 and no other options, but she found the false bottom because she had 43 years of knowledge about how things are built and where their secrets live. The mockery that met her at the salvage post counter was the kind of mockery that has always been aimed at people who see value in overlooked things, the implication that what cannot immediately be appraised cannot possibly be worth anything, that what has been abandoned correctly. Nora understood, as her father had understood, that the most important qualities of a thing are frequently located precisely where no one is looking. In the grain beneath the surface. In the seam that mimics a crack. In the chamber beneath the floor that holds what someone most needed to preserve and most feared to lose. She did not haul that wagon up from the canyon to prove anything to anyone. She hauled it up because it was hers, because she had paid $3.50 for it, and because something in her, the part of her that her father had shaped and her mother had disciplined and 20 years of honest frontier work had tempered, would not let her leave a thing she owned lying at the bottom of a canyon just because retrieving it was difficult. That quality. The refusal to leave what is yours in the dark simply because someone else has decided the dark is where it belongs, is not a loud or demonstrative quality. It does not announce itself. It does not require an audience. It is a quality that shows up in the doing of things, in the early mornings and the long afternoons and the cold nights when the work continues because the work is the answer to the question the world keeps asking. Nora Calloway answered that question the only way she knew how. With her hands. With her father's chisels. With her mother's precision. With everything she had ever been given and had refused to let anyone take away from her, even when they had taken almost everything else. Settle in and remember the story of Nora Calloway, because the world will always need people who understand where the false bottoms are. Friends, if you made it to the end of this story, we are grateful for every minute you spent with us and with Nora today. This channel exists because of people like you, people who value a story told slowly and honestly, without shortcuts. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and if you have not yet subscribed, we would be honored to have you here each week. Here is the question we are sitting with today, and we would love to hear your answer in the comments. What is something in your own life, a place, an object, a skill, a person, that others wrote off as worthless, but that turned out to hold something extraordinary? We read every comment, and we mean that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay close.